Okay, hi everyone. This is the lecture from the PowerPoint, which we'll have for week one. Okay, so first of all, welcome to the course. In this module, we're going to be looking at 11 films, and each of them will feature a representation of the city as an integral part of its cinematography and of its narrative. So the city will be important both for what happens in the film, but also for the visual aspect of the film as well. And we're going to see some recurring themes in this series of films, many of which will start with Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and which we'll see first of all in Metropolis. So really this lecture, well, I do want you to understand Metropolis and as much nuance and detail as you can. I would also like you to pay attention to the fact that this is also really to lay the foundation for what I think are some of the most significant themes in general for what we think about when we think about the history of cinematic representations of the city and of urban life in general, as opposed to rural life or the countryside. Okay. So, Metropolis. Metropolis was released in 1927, and it was directed by the at the time very famous and successful German director Fritz Lang. It tells a story of a futuristic city in which wealthy and privileged individuals have a life of ease and pleasure above ground, but below them there is a workers' city in which people toil operating machines for the good of those who live above. At the start of the film, Freda, the son of one of the wealthiest people in Metropolis, one of what we would call the major industrialists, i.e. the factory owners, essentially, sees a young woman named Maria as she brings children from the workers' city to see how their rich brothers live above ground. You can see that in the garden scene on eCampus. Hopefully you've already seen the film by this point anyway, but watch it again. When Freda follows Maria down to the workers' city, he witnesses an industrial accident which causes him to think of the machines the workers operate as an instantiation of Moloch, an ancient god who demanded human sacrifices. It then emerges that Maria is a religious leader for the workers. She preaches that one day a mediator will come and help with their suffering. The word mediator, or Vermittler in the original German, is interesting, I think. In the German language, it's been used to refer both to the figure of Jesus Christ, i.e. the one who mediates or who establishes the relationship and manages the relationship between God and humanity, and also to the modern figure of the entrepreneur, the one who traditionally borrows money from big capital, say from a bank or from a wealthy investor, and who employs workers. So they mediate between what we might call labor and capital. And Lang is using this word mediator in both of these meanings here. So really one way of reading Metropolis and understanding it is as a kind of mythology of the entrepreneur in some way or another. While this is going on, Freda's father engages a scientist to build a robot which resembles Maria. He plans to use this robot to incite the workers to violence, which will then justify his use of further repressive force against them. This plan initially appears to work, as the robot disguised as Maria encourages the workers to rebel and to form a mob, which nearly destroys their own city, almost drowning their children in the process. The mob next begins a witch hunt as it seeks to burn the robot, whom they still believe is Maria, at the stake. The climax of the film involves a dramatic struggle between Freda, Maria, and Rotvang, the inventor of the robot. Rotvang is killed, and the mob calms down, acknowledging Freda as the mediator. And Metropolis ends with an apparent reconciliation between the two sides, and Freda insists that the mediator between the head and the hand must be the heart. So the two opposing, conflicting sides appear to come together through the kind of figure of the emotionally aware and caring individual, which is represented by Freda and also by Maria at different points in the film. Okay, so what about the themes? What are the things that we're going to take from Metropolis which will help us to embark on this study of urban of the representation of the urban in cinema? So the first thing fairly clearly is the representation of class in the film. The world is split. The world of Metropolis is split pretty much down the middle between workers and non-workers. The workers toil for the sake of the owners, and the non-workers have almost no interest in the suffering that takes place in order to sustain their own lifestyle. This aspect of the film, it was criticized as being very simplistic when it was released, almost like a fairy tale. And it can also be read as a kind of allegory for a traditional Marxist understanding of the world, in which the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are two opposing classes, and in which one exploits the other for the sake of profit and also for the sake of ease and free time. And you can see the difference between the two classes very starkly portrayed in the garden scene, which hopefully you've seen in the film already, and which you can see again on eCampus. The next thing, which I think is pretty clear in the movie, is the interrelationship, we can say, between rationality and irrationality. So we can say that Metropolis shows us a kind of tension between a scientific rationality associated with progress and efficiency, and a tendency for this rationality to transform into a kind of mythology, into a kind of superstition. We can see this very clearly, I think, very deliberately in the Moloch scene, in which Freda hallucinates that the peak of industrial technology, these huge machines which are capable of producing things that had never been able to be produced before, and which really drive the city above ground. He kind of imagines these as if they're equivalent to a kind of ancient mythical god that was demanding ceaseless human sacrifice. And suddenly they don't appear to be very enlightened or rational at all, and they appear to be very backward and kind of anti-progressive. And in this way, Metropolis problematizes the idea of progress through science and technology, and it also problematizes the idea of a kind of modern rationality, which, when looked at from a certain angle, appears to be obeying irrational, destructive impulses. Which moves us on to the idea of mob behavior and a kind of mass irrationality. So we see in Metropolis that both the upper and the lower classes give way to basic impulses and destructive behaviours. The upper classes engage in wild parties, which are led by the highly sexualised robot version of Maria, and the lower classes engage in mass destruction, even though this will have a negative effect on their lives. And this was a major concern for intellectuals and for artists at the time that Metropolis was made. I just mentioned one book, but there are many on this subject that were released around the kind of end of the 1910s and within the 1920s. Arguably, the most famous of which is Freud's group psychology and the analysis of the ego, and psychology and psychology and psychoanalysis in general had been popularizing amongst a certain class of readers for a decent amount of time now the idea that below the surface of civilization there were these kind of destructive impulses which you could never really get away from. Sorry, I'm going to get some water. Be back in a second. Sorry about that. I've been sick for a few days and I haven't been doing much talking, so I think my mouth has gone a bit dry. So yeah, mob behavior, especially in the scene in the kind of party scenes and in the scenes in which the workers destroy their own city is clearly a concern for Lang. Okay, and we also have what we might call a topsy-turvy or an upside down or an inverted relationship between humans and machines. One of the most common criticisms of capitalism at the time that Metropolis was made was that it inverts the relationship between human beings and the machines that they use. And these criticisms are not exclusive to Karl Marx, but they do go back to his writing, and they are found in his writing. And it's worth bearing in mind that this writing was influential, even for people who weren't Marxists or weren't especially left-wing. Marx was a very influential thinker in terms of the way that people thought, especially in Germany, actually, about the consequences of industry on contemporary modern life. So we'll just take a look at some of the quotations that I've uploaded. So we'll start with number 1, and we see factory work exhausts the nervous system to the uttermost. At the same time, it does away with the many-sided play of the muscles and confiscates every atom of freedom, both in bodily and in intellectual activity. Even the lightning of the labor becomes an instrument of torture, since the machine does not free the worker from work, but rather deprives the work itself of all content. Now, there's a scene in Metropolis, which is also on eCampus, in which Freda sees the worker and he's just kind of moving clock hands around, and it's not clear why he's doing it, but he says that he has to keep doing it, otherwise something disastrous will happen. And what Marx is arguing here is that there's something about the way that machines work in factory production which is both very physically demanding and mentally demanding, but also very leads to this situation in which work takes on a very abstract quality. So it's really like doing nothing at all. It's really like just moving clock hands around. There's nothing about it which is interesting, and it's simultaneously very physically demanding and tiring, and also very boring and empty of content. And he goes on to say, Marx goes on to say, we're not going to read all of these quotations, don't worry. But Marx goes on to say that every kind of capitalist production, insofar as it is not only a labour process, but also capital's process of valorization, has this in common, that it is not the worker who employs the conditions of work, but rather the reverse. The conditions of work employ the worker. So you kind of have this image of, as Marx says, the instrument of labour which dominates and soaks up living labour power. And the way that Lang shoots the machines in Metropolis, I think, is very influenced by this kind of image of machines that dominate human individuals, even though they are the product of the work of human individuals. So these machines are not simply autonomous, they're not simply independent of humans, they were made by humans, but because of the kind of social relation in which they exist, they have come to rule over them instead of being useful for them. And Lang, there are some arguments that we'll go into a bit at the end of the lecture about whether Metropolis is ultimately a conservative or a left-wing film. However, in some of the scenes, I think it's undoubted that Lang is influenced, if not directly by Marx, then at least by a general leftist understanding just of the nature of factory work in general. And in the second quote, we see the development of industry And we see this idea that not only does capitalism kind of enforce a particular kind of efficiency and a particular kind of way of doing things and way of making things, but that it also, in this way, and this is something that left-wing thinkers after Marx would have been very concerned with, it generalizes the direct struggle against its rule. And what this means is that it creates a kind of class which Marx considered to be capable of overthrowing capitalist production and replacing it with something else. So we see, by maturing the material conditions and the social combination of the process of production, it matures the contradictions and antagonisms of the capitalist form of that process. What he means by this is that you suddenly get two very distinct classes. As you see in Metropolis, you get a class of owners and a class of non-owners, and those two positions become very polarized, and they kind of inevitably come into conflict with each other for Marx. And Marx understands that this will, or he argues that this will give birth to a kind of new society, this kind of conflict. And we don't see that in Metropolis, actually. We see something else. So we need to return to the film in order to think a little bit more about how we should respond to what Lang's representation is saying and what it's doing in terms of class and also in terms of machines and production. So the other thing that we can think about, the other thing before we get on to the ending, which will recur throughout the course, is an idea of precarity. So although most of Metropolis suggests that there is an unbridgeable distinction between the industrial working class and the class of owners, one scene shows a situation of precarity in which a person suddenly falls from a relatively safe middle-class position into poverty. This occurs when Freda's father's assistant fails to inform his employer of the accident which Freda witnesses and is sacked. Despite the fact that this will result in utter destitution for the assistant, Freda's father is uncaring and appears to believe that this precarity, whereby one can fall into poverty at any moment, is simply a fact of life for certain people. And we'll see this again throughout the film, throughout the course, as we see not just kind of working class and upper class people, but we see these people who kind of inhabit more of a in-between space between the two. And yeah, we'll think about these people as they come up and the kind of relationship that they have to the city and what they can say, what their narratives can say about life in the city. Okay, so the ending of Metropolis is the subject of a degree of debate, I think. On the one hand, it appears that the city achieves a reconciliation between its two opposing sides and that some degree of progress is taking place. Despite this, some critics have seen the ending as simply a victory for the industrialist, who manages to diffuse the threat posed by the workers and to change nothing fundamental about the way in which the world works. Lang tries to present the possibility of a more sympathetic, human capitalism, but several contemporary critics argue that this was either naive or deliberately disingenuous. And disingenuous means when you say something is a certain way, even though you know that it isn't. It's a way of manipulating and a way of pretending to be naive when in actual fact you know what you're doing. And this was a view of Siegfried Kracauer, who was one of the most significant film critics of the period in question, and later into the 50s and even into the 60s, I think. And we can read an extract from one of Krakauer's books on eCampus, and I'll just direct your attention to it now. And we'll just read the section where he deals with the ending. And the language is quite difficult, but we'll help it make sense. So Krakauer says, on the surface, it seems that Freda has converted his father. In reality, however, the industrialist has outwitted his son. The concession he makes amounts to a policy of appeasement that not only prevents the workers from winning their cause, but enables him to tighten his grip on them. His robot stratagem was a blunder inasmuch as it rested upon insufficient knowledge of the mentality of the masses. By yielding to Freda, this is at the end when Freda kind of makes the worker and the industrialist shake hands. The industrialist achieves intimate contact with the workers and is thus in a position to influence their mentality. He allows the heart to speak, a heart accessible to his insinuations. So what Krakauer is arguing here, more or less, is that rather than reaching a compromise with the workers, Freda's father actually advances his position and he begins to manipulate the workers, gain a kind of emotional control over them. And yeah, maybe we can see different kinds of emotional control in our own working lives. This is something that we'll return to throughout the course as well, but it's definitely not the only time where this idea that it's in the interests of industrialists and producers and capital to have some degree of control over people's behavior and people's emotions. It's definitely not the first time that, well, it might be the first time. It's definitely not the only time that this comes up. And actually, more and more modern capitalism is described as involving things like emotional labor and the necessity of performing certain kinds of emotions. So yeah, that's a sidetrack, but that's what Krakauer thinks. He thinks it's ultimately a conservative ending for the movie. Back to the PowerPoint. So yeah, Krakauer also observes that Goebbels and Hitler saw the film Metropolis and that Hitler was so impressed by it that he thought that Lang should make movies for the Nazis. Take from that what you will, but Krakauer and many others did not think of the ending as being especially radical, and something that we will return to is not just the idea that films represent class through their representation of the city, which is something that happens in Metropolis, obviously, and will happen in pretty much all the other films that we'll look at, but also the idea that the representation of class itself does something specific for the way in which people are encouraged to think about the possibilities of life and how life may or may not be able to be different. So yeah, we'll return to this idea. Don't worry at the moment if this feels like it's suddenly too advanced or it feels like it's not making sense. We'll keep going through these themes over and over as we go through each of the films, and they'll gather more and more meaning, and I hope that they'll become more and more clear for you guys, okay? So, task for this week. Watch Metropolis at least once. It's very good and it's on YouTube, so you shouldn't have a problem watching it. Once you've watched it, then go back and watch the individual clips, which I've posted on eCampus, and think about how they relate to the themes which we've spoken about here. Make sure that you understand each of the themes which I've listed and how they relate to Metropolis. They really will form the basis of where we go from here, so it's important that you keep up as best as you can. We'll be returning to these themes over and over, so like I keep saying, so yeah, do just try and get your head around them, try and make sure that you understand them. If you find that the level of English is quite high that I'm using, or if you find that you have difficulties understanding things, then just try your best, okay? And Get in touch if you have questions or difficulties. I know that this is not the easiest way to do the course, and I do want to help you as much as possible. Okay, guys, and I do mean that. I am available by email, and I will do my best to get back to you when I can, okay? All right, that's it then. So take it easy. Have a look at the tasks. I've also uploaded the texts for you that I looked at, so you can read through those if you want to. Next week is double indemnity, and we'll be looking at that. I'll be uploading that once I get the opportunity, essentially. So yeah, hope you guys have a good week, and speak to you next Monday.